The 6 dangerous people. Carl Jung says, "You must not help." There's a truth most people refuse to accept. The greatest act of compassion is sometimes refusing to help. Carl Jung spent decades documenting a dangerous pattern in human psychology. He discovered that helping certain personality types doesn't heal them. It enables them, prevents their psychological growth, and drains your own energy in the process. Jung called these individuals the unlived life carriers, and today you'll learn exactly who they are. But here's what makes this discovery so disturbing. These aren't obviously toxic people. They're often the ones who seem most in need, most deserving, most worthy of your sacrifice. And that's precisely what makes them so dangerous to your psychological well-being. Jung identified 6 specific types of people where traditional help backfires completely. Learning to withdraw your energy from these individuals isn't cruelty. It's the only path to sanity for both parties. So, here's my question for you. Are you a savior? Do you constantly rescue people who don't actually want to be rescued? Because if that sounds familiar, you need to understand something critical about human psychology that Jung spent his entire career mapping. Let's start with the first type. Jung documented patients whose shadow wasn't anger or violence. Their shadow was something far more insidious: complete inertia. These individuals had identified so completely with their unlived life that they'd become psychological black holes. Every ounce of energy you invested in them disappeared without trace. Jung called this state the identification with stagnation, and it's far more common than you think. Here's how you recognize them. They're not temporarily tired or going through a difficult phase. They've built an entire identity around not acting. They use philosophical superiority to justify practical paralysis. They speak about waiting for the perfect moment, about needing to feel inspired, about respecting their natural rhythms. But Jung saw through this immediately. This wasn't wisdom. This was fear wearing a spiritual mask. The chronically lazy person Jung described had one consistent pattern. They could articulate exactly what needed to be done with crystal clarity. They understood their problems, saw the solutions, even acknowledged the consequences of inaction. But they never moved. And here's the critical insight Jung discovered. Your help doesn't create momentum in these individuals. It removes the necessary tension they need to act. Every time you rescue them from the consequences of their inaction, you delay their psychological development. Jung observed this repeatedly in his practice. The parent who keeps paying rent for the adult child who won't work. The partner who takes over all responsibilities while the other person pursues endless self-discovery. The friend who provides constant emotional support while the person makes zero changes to their situation. These helpers believed they were being compassionate. Jung realized they were being used as psychological crutches that prevented growth. The chronically lazy individual needs to feel the full weight of their choices. They need to experience the natural consequences of sustained inaction. Your intervention delays this necessary crisis. Jung wrote that some people only grow through what he called productive suffering. Remove that suffering through misplaced compassion, and you remove their only motivation to change. Jung documented one particularly revealing case in his private notes. A 28-year-old man whose family had supported him for a decade while he claimed to be working on a novel. He had genuine talent, could discuss literature with sophistication, and seemed perpetually on the verge of breakthrough. But the novel never materialized. His family's financial support meant he never had to face the reality that he was using creative aspiration as an excuse for complete life avoidance. It wasn't until his father finally cut him off that the man was forced to confront his pattern. Within 6 months, he had steady employment. Within a year, he'd actually completed more writing than in the previous decade. The help had been the problem. Here's what happens when you finally stop helping the chronically lazy. They'll attempt to guilt you. They'll frame your boundary as cruelty, as abandonment, as proof that you never really cared. They'll find someone else to enable them if possible. But occasionally, rarely, some will finally face the tension they've been avoiding. And that's when actual growth becomes possible. Your job isn't to be there for that moment. Your job is to stop preventing it from arriving. But the chronically lazy aren't the most dangerous type Jung identified. That distinction belongs to someone far more destructive. Jung spent years documenting what he called the compulsion to repeat. These patients orchestrated the same painful scenarios over and over, while genuinely believing they were victims of cruel fate. The cast of characters changed, but the plot remained identical. They were always betrayed, always abandoned, always taken advantage of by people they trusted completely. Here's what made these cases so disturbing for Jung. These individuals weren't consciously choosing their patterns. They were unconsciously attracting and selecting people who would fulfill specific roles in their psychological drama. The betrayer, the abandoner, the narcissist, the commitment phobe. And they did this with supernatural precision. Jung observed something remarkable about repetition compulsion addicts. They possessed an unconscious radar for exactly the wrong people. Put them in a room with 99 healthy individuals and one person who would recreate their trauma, and they'd be magnetically drawn to that single person. This wasn't bad luck. It was unconscious psychological architecture. How does this radar work? Jung discovered that repetition addicts emit subtle signals that healthy people unconsciously avoid while damaged people unconsciously recognize. They telegraph their wounds in ways that attract predators and repel protectors. They ask questions designed to identify who will hurt them in familiar ways. They test boundaries specifically to find people who will violate them predictably. It's not that they want pain, it's that they're unconsciously more comfortable with familiar pain than unfamiliar growth. But here's where it gets truly dangerous for helpers. When you try to rescue someone trapped in repetition compulsion, you're not helping them escape their pattern. You're taking a role in their drama, usually the role of the savior, who will eventually be recast as another villain in their ongoing tragedy. Jung documented this transformation repeatedly. The helper starts with genuine compassion. The repetition addict seems grateful, seems to be making progress. Then something shifts. The addict unconsciously needs you to betray them to complete their familiar narrative. So they begin subtly provoking you, testing you, misinterpreting your actions until you either crack under the pressure or withdraw in exhaustion. Either way, they get to add you to their list of people who hurt them. Your help becomes evidence in their case against humanity. Listen to how they reframe your assistance once the pattern demands you become the villain. You set a boundary to protect yourself. They say you abandoned them when they needed you most. You express concern about their choices. They claim you're controlling and judgmental, just like everyone else. You step back to let them face consequences. They tell others you were never really there for them. The script is already written. You're just playing a part someone else wrote long before you arrived. Jung's protocol for repetition compulsion was radical. Don't take the stage. Don't audition for any role in their drama. The only safe move is refusing to participate entirely. These individuals can only break their pattern through professional therapeutic intervention combined with genuine willingness to examine their own role in recreating trauma. Your compassionate help cannot substitute for this process. Therapy works where friendship fails, because the therapeutic relationship has built-in boundaries that prevent the helper from being absorbed into the pattern. The therapist doesn't rescue, doesn't get emotionally enmeshed, doesn't take responsibility for the patient's choices. This structure is exactly what allows the pattern to finally become visible to the person trapped in it. The third type Jung identified terrified him more than any other, not because they were overtly dangerous, but because they were so perfectly disguised. These were the persona-identified perfectionists, individuals who had invested all their psychic energy into maintaining a flawless external image while their authentic self suffocated in the unconscious. Jung understood that everyone wears a persona. It's the social mask we need to function in collective spaces. But these individuals had made a catastrophic error. They'd confused the mask with their identity. They'd become the performance and lost contact with the performer. This creates what Jung called the perfect person problem. Someone so adapted to social expectations that they've severed all connection to their authentic self and shadow. Here's how you recognize them. Uncanny social perfection. They always know the right thing to say, the appropriate emotion to display, the correct response to every situation. But something feels hollow in their presence. Interactions have an artificial quality, despite being technically flawless. They never seem to have bad days, inappropriate reactions, or human inconsistencies. Watch them carefully, and you'll notice the performance quality Jung described. Their facial expressions arrive half a second too late, as if they're selecting the appropriate reaction rather than experiencing it naturally. They mirror your energy with uncanny precision, becoming exactly what each social situation demands. They speak in phrases that sound profound, but reveal nothing authentic. Conversations with them feel oddly exhausting, despite being superficially pleasant, because you're interacting with a construct rather than a person. Their homes, their social media, their entire lives have been curated into magazine spreads of perfection. But Jung warned about what lies behind that curation: a terrifying emptiness. These individuals have rejected so many aspects of themselves in pursuit of the perfect image that there's almost no authentic self remaining. And all those rejected parts are accumulating in the unconscious, building pressure. But here's what Jung discovered that will save you years of wasted effort. Your help is always perceived as a threat to their perfect image. You cannot help someone who has no conscious contact with their actual problems, because acknowledging problems would crack the persona. They've spent decades constructing. When you try to help them, they don't hear concern. They hear judgment. They interpret your offer of support as evidence that you've seen through their mask. This is why persona-identified individuals are immune to help. Your attempts to assist them trigger defensive responses far more intense than the original problem warranted. They'd rather maintain the illusion of perfection than accept help that implies imperfection exists. Jung observed that these individuals often surround themselves with people who affirm the mask, family members who praise their strength, friends who admire their grace under pressure, communities that celebrate their flawless execution of social expectations. Anyone who questions the performance gets systematically excluded. And here's the truly dangerous part Jung observed. The more perfect the persona, the more catastrophic the eventual shadow eruption. All those rejected shadow aspects don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious like psychological pressure in a sealed container. Eventually, that pressure finds release. The perfect parent has a breakdown and abandons their family. The model employee commits fraud or embezzlement. The spiritual teacher gets caught in a sex scandal or financial exploitation. The devoted spouse has an affair that destroys everything they've built. Jung documented these explosions repeatedly. The higher the persona, the more destructive the fall. He noted that persona-identified individuals often experience their shadow eruption as if it were happening to someone else, as if they were possessed by a force completely foreign to their identity. Because in a sense they were. They denied these aspects so completely that when they finally emerged, they emerged with overwhelming force. What happens to their relationships during these eruptions? Jung observed that the people closest to persona, perfectionists, are often blindsided. They had no idea anything was wrong because the performance was so convincing. The explosion seems to come from nowhere. But Jung understood it had been building for years or decades. Every moment of inauthenticity was another brick in the pressure chamber. Your job isn't to help these individuals. You cannot. Only they can choose to remove the mask and face what's underneath. And most will choose to maintain the persona until it finally breaks them. The compassionate response is to stop affirming the mask through your admiration or concern. Stop participating in the performance. That's the only real help possible. And even then, they'll likely exclude you for refusing to applaud their act. But there's a fourth type even more dangerous than persona identification. Jung called them the unconscious shadow projectors. And understanding them might save your reputation, your relationships, and your sanity. These individuals project their unlived life and unacknowledged darkness onto others with absolute conviction. They don't just misperceive reality, they create alternate realities that feel completely real to them and become increasingly real to others. Jung wrote that this was the single most dangerous psychological pattern he'd ever documented in normal appearing people. Here's how shadow projection operates. Everything the projector cannot accept in themselves gets unconsciously expelled and seen in you instead. If they cannot tolerate their own selfishness, they'll perceive you as selfish with remarkable certainty. If they've denied their own manipulation, they'll be convinced you're manipulating them. The stronger their denial, the more certain their projection. What makes this terrifying is their complete conviction. They're not lying. They genuinely perceive you as possessing qualities that exist, primarily in their own unconscious, and they'll gather evidence to support their perception while remaining blind to contradictory information. Jung observed that shadow projectors rewrite history, reinterpret neutral events, and recruit others into their distorted reality with devastating effectiveness. Jung described this as a reality distortion field. The projector doesn't just see you incorrectly, they convince others to see you through their distorted lens. How does this happen? The projector's absolute certainty creates a psychological pressure on observers. When someone accuses you of hidden motivations with complete conviction, repeatedly, with emotional intensity, others begin to wonder if there's truth to the accusations. The projector seems so certain. They're so emotionally affected. Maybe they're seeing something real. This is how families turn on scapegoated members, how workplaces mob innocent employees, how communities destroy individuals based on accusations that have no basis. In reality, the shadow projector becomes the center of the storm, and everyone else gets caught in the distortion field. Jung documented one case that illustrates this perfectly. A patient convinced that her sister was stealing from the family and manipulating their elderly mother. She could cite dozens of incidents as proof. The sister's kindness was manipulation. Her generosity was guilt. Her concern was control. The patient recruited other family members into this perception until the sister was essentially excommunicated. Years later, after the patient underwent intensive therapy, she realized with horror that every quality she'd seen in her sister was actually her own denied shadow. She was the one being manipulative and controlling, but she'd been so convinced of her perceptions that she'd destroyed her sister's relationship with the entire family based on a projection. Your help cannot penetrate. Shadow projection. When you try to correct their misperceptions, they interpret your corrections as further evidence of the very qualities they're projecting. Your denial of being manipulative becomes proof of how manipulative you are. Your explanation of your actual motivations gets twisted into evidence of your deception. You present facts, they see lies. You show vulnerability, they see strategy. There is no winning move inside the projection field. Jung's protocol was absolute. Withdraw immediately. Do not attempt to convince them, defend yourself, or prove their perceptions wrong. Shadow projectors are immune to contradictory evidence. Your facts will be absorbed and transformed into supporting data for their projection. The only safe response is strategic withdrawal before they organize others into their collective delusion. And here's Jung's most chilling observation about shadow projectors. They often successfully recruit what he called the collective into their distorted reality. These are the flying monkeys, the people who believe the projector's narrative and become enforcers of the projection. They haven't experienced your supposed terrible qualities firsthand, but the projector's conviction is so powerful, their emotional distress so genuine, that these secondary players accept the projection as fact. Suddenly you're dealing not with one distorted perception, but with an entire system organized around a lie. Jung's extraction protocol has stages. First, recognize you're dealing with projection rather than legitimate conflict. Second, document everything for your own sanity, because they will rewrite history. Third, stop defending yourself to the projector. Fourth, maintain your reality with people outside the projection field. Fifth, withdraw completely if possible. Sixth, accept that you cannot fix this through reason, evidence, or compassion. The projector must do their own shadow work. You cannot do it for them. But here's what Jung found most disturbing. Shadow projectors don't just destroy individual relationships, they poison entire social systems. Families organize around their projections. Workplaces mob innocent employees. Communities destroy individuals based on projected accusations that have no basis in reality. The projector becomes the center of a psychological storm, unconsciously recruiting others to attack the very qualities they cannot accept in themselves. Your job is to get out of the storm, not to convince the projector they're creating weather patterns that don't exist in external reality. The fifth dangerous type combines all the previous patterns with one additional element that makes them nearly impossible to help: ego inflation. These individuals haven't just projected their shadow. They've identified with archetypal energies far beyond their capacity to integrate. They've become possessed by the savior, the prophet, the judge, or the enlightened one. Jung called this archetypal identification, and he considered it one of the most dangerous psychological states possible in seemingly functional people. What does archetypal identification actually mean? Jung understood that archetypes are transpersonal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious. The wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster. These are energies far larger than any individual ego. In healthy psychology, we can access these patterns temporarily without confusing them with our personal identity. We can teach from the wise old man position, then return to being a regular person who doesn't know everything. We can nurture from the great mother position, then return to being someone with limitations and needs. But inflated individuals lose this boundary. They identify their small personal ego with vast archetypal energy. They don't just access the prophet archetype to deliver a message. They become the prophet. They don't temporarily embody the healer to help someone. They are the healer. Their personal identity has been swallowed by the archetype, and now they're possessed by something much larger than they can integrate. Jung observed that inflated individuals appear spiritually evolved, morally superior, or intellectually enlightened. This apparent elevation makes them infinitely more dangerous than obvious narcissists, because people willingly submit to their authority. Followers don't realize they're dealing with someone whose ego has identified with transpersonal contents it cannot properly contain. Here are the warning signs Jung documented in detail. They never doubt their own motivations while being completely blind to their shadow. Ask them about their flaws, and they'll speak in spiritual cliches about being on a journey or learning lessons. But they show no genuine uncertainty, no real self-questioning, no authentic doubt about whether their actions align with their stated values. They've moved beyond such concerns because they're identified with the archetype's certainty. They interpret disagreement as resistance to truth itself, rather than as useful information. If you question their perspective, you're not offering a different viewpoint. You're resisting the truth. You're stuck in ego. You're not ready for their wisdom. You're threatened by their light. They cannot process disagreement as legitimate because they're not speaking as a person with opinions. They're channeling archetypal truth. They possess extraordinary charisma combined with rigid thinking. The archetype they're identified with gives them magnetic presence. People feel drawn to them, inspired by them, changed by them. But beneath the charisma is complete psychological inflexibility. There's only one right way, their way, because it's not really their way, it's the way. Jung documented different flavors of inflation. The savior inflated believe they must rescue everyone, that others cannot survive without their intervention, that they alone can see the path to salvation. The guru inflated position themselves as enlightened teachers whose role is to awaken the sleeping masses. The judge inflated see themselves as arbiters of morality, called to expose evil and punish wrongdoing. Each type is convinced of their special role and blind to how their inflation is actually causing harm. What happens to their followers? Jung observed a pattern he found deeply troubling. Followers of inflated individuals often become psychologically smaller over time. They start to doubt their own perceptions, defer to the inflated one's judgment, organize their lives around supporting the inflated one's mission. They lose contact with their own inner authority because they've projected it entirely onto the inflated leader. This creates a codependent system where the follower's diminishment feeds the leader's inflation. Your help cannot reach an inflated person because they perceive themselves as beyond help. They're the ones who help others. They're the enlightened ones, teaching the unenlightened. Any suggestion that they might need assistance is interpreted as your failure to recognize their elevated state. Jung warned that inflated individuals eventually collapse under the psychic tension of identifying their small ego with archetypal energies. The persona cannot sustain the weight of the archetype indefinitely, but before they collapse, they often cause devastating damage to their followers. Jung documented spiritual teachers who exploited students sexually while claiming it was sacred initiation. Business leaders who destroyed employees' lives while convinced they were serving a higher purpose. Parents who psychologically damaged their children while certain they were providing superior guidance. The inflation prevented them from seeing the harm they caused because they'd identified with the archetype's light while remaining completely unconscious of the archetype's shadow. When the collapse finally comes, it's often spectacular. The savior is revealed as the one who needed saving. The guru is exposed as profoundly unenlightened. The judge is discovered to be guilty of what they condemned in others. Jung observed that inflated individuals often experience their collapse as victimization, as if they're being attacked by forces of darkness, rather than facing the natural consequences of their inflation. They learn nothing from the fall because they still don't have access to genuine self-reflection. Your job is not to save them from collapse. Only they can deal with the psychic tension of their inflation. Your job is to maintain your personal integrity by refusing to be recruited into their following. Don't feed the inflation through admiration or submission. That's the only real help possible. And it's not really help for them, it's protection for you. The final type Jung identified might seem less dangerous than the others, but understanding them is critical because they're the ones most likely to trick your compassion. These are the unintegrated empaths, highly sensitive individuals who are natural emotional shock absorbers but haven't integrated their shadow. Specifically, they haven't integrated their intelligence, their strength, and their right to boundaries. These individuals see everything. They perceive others' wounds with remarkable clarity. They sense dysfunction before it becomes obvious. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore, but they haven't learned to use this gift strategically. Instead, they've been conditioned to believe their sensitivity is a burden, their perceptions are wrong, and their needs don't matter. Here's how you recognize them. They blame themselves for everything. They apologize for existing. They can articulate the exact problem in a relationship or system, but feel powerless to act on their perception. They fear being too sensitive, too emotional, too much. Society has taught them that their gift is a curse. They've been gaslit so consistently that they no longer trust their own perceptions, despite those perceptions being remarkably accurate. Jung documented these individuals with particular interest because he recognized in them an unrealized potential. These weren't broken people. They were powerful people who'd been systematically taught to suppress their power. Their sensitivity wasn't dysfunction. It was sophisticated data collection. They could read micro-expressions, sense hidden emotions, detect lies, and feel the psychological atmosphere of any room. But they'd learned to silence these perceptions rather than trust them. And here's where helping becomes enabling. Your job is not to fix the situation for them. Your help should only come in the form of validation and empowerment. Reinforce that their sensitivity is their strength. Confirm that their perceptions are data, not dysfunction. Help them understand that their gift is information gathering, not information absorbing. They don't have to take on everyone's pain. They can observe it, understand it, and choose whether to engage with it. But you cannot do their shadow integration work for them. They must be allowed to hit their clarity event. That moment when their pattern recognition finally overwhelms their need to believe the best in people. That instant when they stop silencing themselves and start trusting their perceptions absolutely. This transformation cannot be rushed or facilitated through external help. It must emerge from their own psychological necessity. Jung documented what he called the clarity event in his case files. It usually arrived through betrayal. The empath would finally be hurt so badly by someone they'd protected and enabled that their entire psychological structure would shift in one explosive moment. The person they'd made excuses for would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and suddenly all the observations the empath had been suppressing would flood into consciousness with devastating clarity. What happens after the clarity event? Jung observed a transformation he found both beautiful and terrifying. The empath's shadow integration began. They reclaimed their intelligence, acknowledging that their perceptions were accurate all along. They reclaimed their strength, setting boundaries they'd never allowed themselves before. They reclaimed their right to protect themselves, withdrawing energy from people and situations that drained them. The transformed empath became what Jung called selectively empathetic. They didn't lose their sensitivity. They gained discernment. They could still feel everything, but they chose consciously what deserved their energy. They became immune to manipulation because they saw it coming from miles away. They became psychologically dangerous to predators because their gift was no longer available for exploitation. Jung wrote about one patient whose transformation perfectly illustrated this pattern. She'd spent 15 years in a marriage where her husband's alcoholism and infidelity were treated as her failure to be supportive enough. She could sense every lie, feel every betrayal, knew exactly what was happening. But she'd been trained to doubt her perceptions, to blame herself, to try harder. The clarity event came when she discovered he'd been stealing from their children's college fund to support his affair. Something broke. Or rather, something finally integrated. Within 6 months, she'd left the marriage, established iron boundaries, and begun rebuilding her life. Her sensitivity hadn't diminished, but she was no longer using it to enable his dysfunction. She was using it to protect herself and her children. When you rescue unintegrated empaths from situations they need to escape themselves, you delay this critical integration. When you fight their battles, you prevent them from discovering their own strength. When you validate their victim narrative instead of their power, you keep them trapped in the very pattern they need to transcend. Jung was clear about this. The helper who keeps saving the empath is preventing the empath's awakening. What does healthy help look like for the unintegrated empath? Reflect back their strength, not their victimhood. When they describe someone's terrible behavior, don't focus on how terrible the other person is. Focus on asking why they're choosing to stay. When they articulate their accurate perceptions, validate those perceptions rather than helping them explain them away. When they express fear about being too sensitive, reframe sensitivity as intelligence gathering. Point them toward their power, not their pain. But ultimately, they must choose their own integration. You cannot force it. You cannot rescue them into it. The clarity event comes when it comes, and they must walk through their own shadow integration alone. Your job is to stop preventing that process through misguided help. Here's what Jung discovered about all 6 of these dangerous types. The moment you stop enabling them, you force them to face the psychological tension required for their own growth. This isn't cruelty. This is the only form of real compassion available. True compassion isn't about reducing another person's suffering. It's about honoring their sovereignty and respecting their right to face their own challenges. Jung documented something remarkable about helpers who finally learned to withdraw their energy from these 6 types. They didn't become cold or disconnected. They became what Jung called selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flows. They learned that the highest service isn't sacrificing yourself for people who don't want to be saved. It's protecting your own light so it can actually illuminate rather than being drained into psychological black holes. Think about each type one more time. The chronically lazy need consequences, not cushions. The repetition addicts need therapeutic intervention, not another role player in their drama. The persona perfectionists need to crack, not receive more admiration for their mask. The shadow. Projectors need space, not your attempts at correction. The inflated prophets need to collapse, not gain more followers. The unintegrated empaths need empowerment, not rescue. Your help, no matter how well-intentioned, prevents the very transformation these individuals need. Your greatest contribution to the world isn't helping everyone who seems to need it. It's developing the wisdom to distinguish between people who genuinely want transformation and people who want someone to enable their patterns. Most people don't actually want to change. They want their pain to stop while their patterns continue. Your compassionate intervention often allows exactly that. You reduce their pain below the threshold required for change while their dysfunction continues untouched. So here's your final insight. The 6 types Jung identified aren't your responsibility to fix. They're your responsibility to recognize and strategically avoid, not from a place of judgment or superiority, but from psychological wisdom about how transformation actually occurs. People change when the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of changing. Your help often reduces that necessary pain below the threshold required for change. Walk away from the chronically lazy. Refuse roles in repetition dramas. Stop affirming perfect personas. Withdraw from shadow projectors. Don't follow inflated prophets. Empower, but don't rescue unintegrated empaths. This isn't abandonment. This is the highest form of respect. You're honoring their capacity to face their own psychological work while protecting your energy for people who actually want transformation. Which of these 6 types do you need to stop helping? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this video helped you understand Jung's radical approach to compassion, make sure you subscribe for more insights into psychology that challenges everything you thought you knew about helping others. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.